I don't think I have to guess. This is your favorite time of the week. Oklahoma fans, you get to talk Sooners football with us for the next hour every Wednesday, 11:30 a.m. Central Time, right here on the Voice of College Football OU. I'm Mark Rogers. Of course, we got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football. He makes it happen now for 44 consecutive weeks. Jason, how you doing?
Doing good, Mark. Looks like I hate to say this, but it looks like there's actually a little bit of a time to breathe right now.
Yeah.
There's finally a time where there's not. I say that, and there will be a flood of transfer portal or something else happen. But there's a little bit of a lull here right now. It looks like between this little period and when spring practice starts. So I think it's a good opportunity to catch for people to catch their breath because it's been kind of fast and furious since the bowl game actually.
Before we get to the first news of the day, and of course, we invite everyone to leave your comments and your questions in the live chat, and we will get to them. I was talking to my USC guy, Matt Zemek from Trojans Wire yesterday, and he had mentioned that Lincoln Riley was asked at his latest USC news conference, I believe the National Signing Day news conference, was asked about taking players from Oklahoma, and he took some exception to that and basically said they were in the transfer portal for anyone. And I took them, we took them from the transfer portal is how he corrected that statement.
It's funny, Mark. Anytime some of that talk just starts to die down a little bit, it seems like either whether it's Riley or whether it's I think it was Coward that was on there. I mean, I think he's the catalyst for a lot of this. Seems to do something to pour some more gasoline back on the fire. I mean, it just won't die. So I think it's one of those things where, I mean, I think eventually, right, once the season starts and things like that, you'll see that conversation obviously start dying off a little bit. But I think in the minds of many Oklahomans, I think USC has become enemy number three. I think it's going to be hard to come above Texas and even Oklahoma State for that matter. But specifically from the aspect that Oklahoma obviously doesn't play USC on a regular basis, so the only time that they would play them probably is likely in a bowl situation or a playoff situation. But yeah, they are very quickly becoming the biggest, I think, uh, ire that in Oklahoma fans' minds with everything that's happened, and just not letting it die. I think is more the biggest concern. Maybe not concern, but I think the biggest kind of point of contention. I think at this point.
We are 1 week removed from National Signing Day last Wednesday, February 2nd. And not long after we got off the air yesterday with all of you, there were 5 players that were not officially signed at that point and have since signed to make the class total at 21 signed letters of intent. I find it interesting that there are, at least according to 247 Sports, no early enrollees. That's kind of rare. Number 2 class in the Big 12, number 8 in the nation. So, Jason, running down those 5 players that Oklahoma was able to get under the wire on Wednesday.
Yeah, and that's an error on the 247. There are, and we can talk here. Yeah, that's not. There are some early enrollees, and we can talk.
I was surprised by that.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's some of those, but yeah, as we mentioned last week, Mark, there was probably 6 or 7 guys that Oklahoma was in on and really kind of waiting a decision confirmation last Wednesday. 5 of the ones, I think that most of the ones that Oklahoma expected, and I kind of expected Oklahoma to secure those signatures, they did. So they had 2. Obviously, Gentry Williams is one that we knew of before we kind of came off the air last Wednesday. So that was obviously not a surprise. It's been really, really pro Oklahoma. Even Brent Venables said afterwards, after he had his press availability after the signing period, he basically said we would have had to done a lot of things wrong, a lot of things to screw up that. So I think he was pretty strong to Oklahoma regardless. So that obviously that one was not a surprise, but really somebody that Oklahoma I think desperately wanted, desperately needed in the back end of that defense. So the four other ones, two from California and two from Florida. Grayson Halton is the defensive line guy, yeah, like 6'3", 275 from. He's out of California. He was a Oregon commit with a changing of the coaching staff at Oregon. Oklahoma was able to get in there and then secured his signature number 35 ranked defensive lineman in the country. Really good interior defensive lineman for Oklahoma. Um, Cavante Henry is another kid from California. He is an edge guy. Previously committed to Michigan. Again, kind of the same situation with some of the changes on the specifically on the defensive side of the ball for Michigan, allowed Oklahoma to kind of get in there. So they've got two real flips, from that perspective. And then R. Mason Thomas he's a 3-star guy from Florida. He's kind of hovered in that 3 to 4-star period. So he's going to be another edge guy right behind Henry. Interestingly enough, just in terms of overall ranking as an edge guy. Henry was number 33. Mason Thomas was number 34 in the country. Like I said, he's a guy that kind of hovered between a 3 and a 4. If you look at the composite, he's a 3, but overall, I think he was a 4, 4-star guy. He was a commitment to Iowa State. Oklahoma got that flip late. So, and then Jamarian Hurt is the other guy. He's a little bit of a more of a raw kid, an athlete, probably is going to be more a receiver. I think is where he probably will land at Oklahoma. Number 28th ranked athlete in the country, a 3-star guy as well. So with those additions, Mark, those 5 guys, Oklahoma went up to number 8 overall in the 2022 247 rankings, which obviously we've talked about that with everything that happened with Riley. Oklahoma at one point was ranked 21. So to get to 21 to number 8, and really had um, one of the best actual late signing periods classes here. That obviously most of these kids are signed early on in the early period now. So this is one of the better gets that are one of the better classes that Oklahoma's had here late, and overall it's one of the better classes that they've had over the last few years. Coming in like I said, number 8 overall, best class that they've had since 2019. So in a time where absolutely is needed. So it's pretty much over. I think there's one, and there's a lot of comments about this. There's one kid, Labias Overton, who is one of the best defensive lineman recruits in the country. Was a 2023 kid. He has reclassified to 2022. It really looks like A&M's probably the team to beat here. They're
Surprise, surprise.
yeah. They are very in on him. So it looks like Oklahoma's still in the mix here. I think he's within their top 3, top 4. So I think there's a couple of angles that's interesting. Overton's dad actually played offensive line at Oklahoma in the 90s, early 90s, but his dad is really really big on in the A&M side. I think he works in College Station or with the A&M athletic department. So you take that for whatever you will. But so he's a guy that Oklahoma is in on, and really a little bit of a surprise here. And then the only other one, Mark, is we've talked a little bit about this kid as well, Josh Connerly. He's a 5-star offensive lineman. He's one of those kids that's probably going to be well into February, could be March, April timeframe before he makes a decision. So obviously he's going to be a late, obviously not going to be an early enrollee. So I think that's a kid that Oklahoma probably. I mean, I think they would still take, but it's something that as part of that consideration won't wait for won't be in here for a while. So and a couple of the kids, Mark, that you had talked about, from an early enrollee perspective. Gentry Williams will be a guy that's in there early. Javante Barnes from a running back, he's in early. And then there's quite a few other ones. A lot of the linebackers, Jaron Kane, Kobe McKenzie, a lot. So there's a decent amount of the kids that are actually have actually came in early. So that'll, when we start talking about some of those position previews, I think those are those are some of the things that we'll begin to talk about, just in terms of how they'll be able to integrate themselves. I think one of the big ones is Javante Barnes being able to be in here in the spring with a running back room that's fairly wide open, with Kennedy Brooks leaving. Obviously, he was the main ball carrier last year with you know with Eric Gray getting a little bit of time, and then Marcus Major as well. But I think that will be really a big benefit for him, along with the 10 transfers that Oklahoma has had. There's a couple of them that probably won't be in until the summer, but a good majority of those will be here in the spring for Oklahoma fans to get a good look at come spring game time.
Talking OU with all of you for the next 45 minutes or so right here at the Voice of College Football. If you've not done it, please subscribe to the channel and hit that bell for the notifications to know when we go live, which our aim is each and every Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. Central Time with our Sooners live show. Jason, in particular during the season, in addition to post-game work, will jump on live from time to time. So hit that bell for the notifications to know when we may go live with breaking news or reaction of any sort. All right. There's a comment that came in that you referenced from our guy, Big Mac Mully Sports, about these Jerry Schmidt workouts. No joke. Was seeing on the father of Nick Evers' Twitter yesterday that he had gained 8 pounds in 2 weeks. Love the culture that's being established.
Yeah, Mark, I think that we've talked about this a lot, but I just don't think that this point can be oversold as much as it can, just on the where Oklahoma has come over the last couple of years under Benny Wiley from a strength and conditioning perspective, and then where they're at, where they will be at least by the time fall rolls around. And yeah, I saw that tweet as well. I mean, if you really work at 8 pounds in 2 weeks isn't something that's astronomical, but I think at the same time it kind of shows the level of strategy that Oklahoma is going to have from a weight room perspective, and from a strength and conditioning perspective. It's much more important, I think, to this staff. It's much more and I think for a lot of ways on the, even, I know he's referencing the quarterback here, but I think on the defensive side of the ball, defensive line, offensive line as well, just to get some of those kids into the body type that Venables and all the defensive staff want them to be in. So I think the one thing that you can rest assured come next year, you can see a team that will probably be much more physical, much more aggressive at the point of attack than they have in the past. So I think Schmidt will play a pivotal role in that. Probably the biggest role of anyone, I think, Mark, from now until fall practice starts, because he gets more time with those kids than really any of the coaches do. Specifically, the on-field coaches don't have the opportunity to work with them as of yet until spring practice even gets rolling. So it's very, very important buy-in. I think very important, and I think some of the current players that were part of that, the regime the last few years, have already talked about, how excited they are. I know they're probably not excited at the time, but I think how excited they are about what this will do to them from a physicality perspective.
It surprises me that there is a difference, because if you look at it, there are 65 teams playing Power 5 football, and certainly some Group of 5 that are playing at the level of a Power 5 and beyond that. And you would just think, with the millions of dollars that are spent by all these universities on the football program, and with the information that's out there and the level of education by nutritionists and workout guys, strength and conditioning coaches, and otherwise, you would think that everyone would be performing at an optimal level and would have the latest in information and technology at their fingertips and would be pushing their athletes the same. But, and especially at a place like Oklahoma. But yeah, there is, we hear accounts of it all the time when players move to other locations and other teams and programs, and when coaches move. There is a definite difference between programs, and certainly Brent Venables knows that this team's going to be playing SEC football here soon at some point. Not that it wouldn't be needed otherwise, but I think it just speaks to what he values on the football field, the type of team he wants, and certainly Lincoln Riley was achieving at a high level and should continue to, but it's just a different emphasis. Obviously, if you got a football team and you're going to win 10, 12 games in the Big 12, you're physical to a certain extent, but to max it out and reach a new level, then it appears as though they needed this a kick in the tail.
Yeah, I think so, Mark. I think the knock on Riley, and I think where he came from, from East Carolina and then Texas Tech as well. I think the knock on some of those teams that they've had is they've been a little soft, right? I mean, I think they've been a little soft defensively. They've not had the same really level of physicality, level of toughness that you would expect out of an Alabama, a Georgia, a Clemson, and LSU. Some of these teams that are continuing to not only win national championships, but they're winning playoff games. So I think and it was very interesting last week when Brent Venables had his press conference, and this shows he's won over the fans, he's won over the players, and he's won over the media in a very, very quick way. I think one of the things that they had they had one kind of a press availability with him last week, immediately following not immediately following, I think Wednesday afternoon, and they had some technical difficulties with the Zoom press conference. So what Venables did is he said, okay, we'll just do it over, and then they did it over on Thursday, and he spent almost 2 hours with the media, between about an hour and a half and 2 hours with the media, and just and answered every single one of their questions, and so and it was very long-winded answers. It wasn't very just quick coach speak stuff. So I think he's players see that, coaches see that, fans see that, and I think that does a lot of good things. But the one thing that kind of came across is he was very of these. I don't know if you noticed it, but of these 5 guys that Oklahoma got here in the late period, every one of them are on the defensive side of the ball. So and he even mentioned I don't know if this, probably knowing the way Brent is, this wasn't necessarily kind of a shot at Riley, but he made the comment that you've got to be able to play defense to win championships. You can't just outscore teams. You've got to be able to play a little bit of defense. So I think like I said, that the emphasis that they're going to have on that side of the ball, I think is going to be very interesting to watch through this first year for Oklahoma. How much better will they be able to be productivity wise on the field, based on strength and conditioning, and based on the teaching that they're going to get from this defensive staff, who is you can make an argument one of the better defensive staffs in the country, at least top 5 country overall, with who all they've been able to bring in. With Todd Bates, you got Ted Roof, obviously you've got Venables, and then Jay Valai in the back end, and a lot of the guys that have went through and have won playoff games, have won championships. So I think that's honestly the probably the biggest thing that most fans are very interested in. I think, Mark, and I think it's a fresh perspective. Riley was one of those. He was very, very close to the vest. He was, that's not going to change. He's not going to give a lot of access. He's not going to reveal a whole lot of things. And Jeff Lebby had his initial, all the coaches were made available, and he came out and said that Dylan Gabriel's the guy. There's not going to be a quarterback competition. There's no, there's none of that. He's the guy. He said he's the only guy that we have on campus that has thrown a pass at the FBS level. There's no sense in going through a process of making this a quarterback competition. Yes, they have all the confidence in the world that Nick Evers is going to be a great quarterback. I think they have all the confidence in the world starting 2023 that Jackson Arnold is going to be a good quarterback. So I think that's a breath of fresh air for a lot of people that know, okay, you're lying to me, and please don't tell me that you think that, in all reality, that that Austin Kendall and Kyler Murray was actually a legitimate quarterback controversy, or not a competition, I should say. So I think that's very. I think a lot of the things that you're getting from these coaches, I think, is making fans, even more excited for this season on, not only what they're going to see on the field, but just the approach that some of these guys are taking to with this team.
Appreciate everybody being here at the Voice of College Football for our Oklahoma Live show. As I believe I was in the midst of making contact with our possible guest here. Yeah. So ESPN released a returning production rankings. And I'll go through and look to see exactly how that's measured, because with offensive statistics, with yardage, that can be measured. Otherwise, I don't know where they go with that, with some other positions, but tackles, that sort of thing. But they've got Oklahoma ranked number 71 nationally in returning production rankings. And this is a Bill Connolly metric. Returning production, all 131 FBS teams, 64% coming back offensively. The Sooners return just 47% offensively. That ranks 117th. Then with the transfer portal, that I don't think that these rankings are as valid as they once were. When you lose a Caleb Williams and a Spencer Rattler, you lost 100% of your passing yardage.
Sure.
I don't know if there's something to counteract the ranking to say, well, we gained a guy that's thrown 30 touchdowns in Dylan Gabriel. So it's not like there's not a replacement at or near the same caliber of what was lost. OU brings back 82% of its production on the defensive side of the ball, which is 15th in the country.
Yeah, I think to your point, Mark, there's a lot of, on the offensive side of the ball, there's a lot of productivity. I mean, when you lose those two quarterbacks, obviously you're going to lose 100% of your passing, and they've lost a decent amount of their receiving with Jaden Hazelwood and Mario Williams, both being gone. So yeah, you're absolutely right. They're going to have some guys step up on the offensive side of the ball. But I think with the kids that they got, the kids that they've brought in, they put themselves in a good position. You can make an argument, that I don't think you can make the argument that Dylan Gabriel is more talented than Caleb Williams. We all know that Caleb Williams is probably a more talented overall quarterback, athlete, football player than Dylan Gabriel is. But I think the one thing that honestly can't be overstated or undersold, or however you want to put it, is that when you have a kid like that that comes in and he already knows the offense really, really well, I think it's very, I think it's very helpful. And Jeff Lebby even talked about that. It's very helpful for a kid that comes in and knows this, and knows the system, and kind of help some of these other guys in terms of the install, because that's obviously some of the best, some of the biggest stuff that they'll have going on early on here in the spring on the offensive side of the ball is just that install. So with that, the skill positions are the skill position is fine. I think Oklahoma still has a lot of talent at the skill position. I think the running back room is probably, even though they lose their top player, I think the running back room is probably better overall with the talent that they have coming in, and what they have returning. They're really solid at the receiver position. Still have Marvin Mims. Jalil Farouk is a guy that really played well in the bowl game. He'll have a much better, a much more, much bigger role in this offense this year. Would not be surprised to see Jaden Gibson as a wide receiver come in and play a lot as a true freshman. Obviously, they've lost a few. Theo Weiss will be back in there in that mix as well. So I think that they've got the talent at the skill position, to be successful. I think a lot of it's going to come down to both the offense and defensive lines and how effective that they can be on those sides of the ball. And I think one thing that will be very, very interesting to see, Mark, in terms of what we've talked about from a skill position perspective. I've haven't seen anything official, but I've heard some rumors here that Billy Bowman might move back to the offensive side of the ball. I think that's where a lot of people thought that he probably would be initially, but they needed a little bit more help. But how they've recruited through the back end, what they've added through the transfer portal, may give Oklahoma a little bit of a room to move him back over to the offensive side of the ball. So I think that's I think that's one of those things that Oklahoma will be. We'll have the skill position players. They always have. They always will. Here at this new age of Oklahoma football. So I think, and then I think that just kind of delves into this question we have on the screen here about Bray Walker. I think one of the things, they're going to have some opportunity for some kids to step up on the offensive line, and I think Bray Walker is one of those guys who has been in this program for quite some time. He was a 5-star kid. I think he's just been a little bit stiff in his movements, and just maybe not quite as athletic as some of those other guys. So it'll be interesting to see how this offensive line kind of shapes out. I think it's not been as good I think most people would agree, over the last couple of years, as expected, or as it has been previously. And I think from what I believe is a lot of that has to do with what we've continuously came back to here, Mark, is just the strength and conditioning side, not having those guys be as big and as strong and as physical as they've been in the past. So I think that's again going to be where the rubber meets the road here come 2022. Do they have the strength? Can they build their bodies in such a way that they can be much stronger at the point of attack, both on the offense and defensive lines?
We appreciate everybody being here at the Voice of College Football for our weekly Oklahoma show, 11:30 a.m. Central Time each and every Wednesday. But again, hit that bell for the notifications to know when we go live, because sometimes we need to deviate from that schedule. We also, if there is breaking news and we are able to go live, we will in the moment. So Oklahoma fans hate Oklahoma State, now hate USC with Lincoln Riley, but I don't know that anybody still can top Texas. We have taken note in recent weeks of, I don't necessarily see anything today, but there's been a lot of Texas talk in our live chat, and they would be the team that would get the most chatter after the Sooners. So we thought, during the off season here, we would bring our Texas guy, that Matthew Miller does the Texas post game here at the Voice of College Football over on our Texas channel. So if you want to know the enemy, check out our Texas content at the Voice of College Football. And so we got Matthew on the line with us today. Hey, Matthew, how's it going?
It's going good, Mark. How about you?
Doing well. Matthew, this is Jason Ray from Last Word on College Football.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Hey, nice to meet you too.
So the way this would work best is for you guys to go back and forth and leave me out of it, but I'll get us started by just, Jason and I have discussed in recent weeks the overlap recruiting battles for players. Matthew, where do you think that stands? Do you think Texas got the upper hand? If you just look at the recruiting rankings, you would say yes, but that doesn't necessarily speak to some of the players that were on both teams' target list. So just your thoughts on Texas recruiting and as it pertains to OU.
Well, to me, it comes down to two players, Kobe McKenzie and obviously Devin Campbell. And it would be, who would you rather have? And to be honest with you, I'd probably rather have Kobe McKenzie, just because if you look at our offensive line class, it was very good, even if you take out Devon Campbell. But Devon Campbell is a 5-star. He's the best interior offensive lineman in the country. And he's one of the 10 best players in this recruiting class in the whole country. So he's definitely a good player to have. And Texas hasn't had a class like this ever on the offensive line. This is more like an Oklahoma type class. Oklahoma's had the offensive line. Oklahoma's had defensive lines like that in the past as well on the opposite side of the ball. And Texas really hasn't had that. That's been the low point of this Texas football recruiting in the past 10 years. That's been the problem. We haven't gotten the offensive linemen. We haven't gotten the defensive linemen. I mean, that's been seen. Obviously, we haven't had a first-round pick on the offensive line since 2012. So it's just been part of the problem. If these guys come in here get developed, this will be a spectacular class, and that's obviously been the biggest issue. We get in this talent, we get in 5 stars, 4 stars, and they end up playing like 3 stars. So as long as the coaching staff can do that, I think we'll be fine. But I think personally, this cycle we got the upper hand. We'll see how that goes forward. Obviously, you guys got a new coaching staff, so that definitely helped us. All this helped us. I mean, Lincoln Riley leaving, Brian Kelly going to LSU, all this turmoil in college football definitely helped Texas build up this recruiting class after coming off a disaster of a season, 5-7, lost to Kansas. Unacceptable, can't happen. So this is a spectacular class coming off of that.
Yeah, man, I think those are certainly fair points, especially the two kids that you mentioned. I think when Kobe McKenzie had decommitted to Oklahoma and then committed to Texas, I think that was a huge blow for Oklahoma. A lot of people thought that was the really kind of the bell cow, so to speak, for Oklahoma's recruiting class, at least in the early signing period. So losing him early on was certainly a huge blow, and I think him. Brent Venables able to kind of bring him back to Oklahoma was a huge win. You're absolutely right. You guys have had one of the best, if not the best, offensive line recruiting classes, and I think Devin Campbell was a kid that Oklahoma was really excited about the opportunity to potentially to get him in Oklahoma, but no, he obviously signed with Texas. So yeah, I think exactly where you guys were you hit the nail on the head. I think that the coaching changes throughout the country and kind of the domino effect that started with, I think, Lincoln Riley, I think helped Texas from that perspective. And I think, exactly what you mentioned. I think it comes down to doing it on the field. I think the same thing can kind of be said for both sides here over the last couple of years, specifically from an offensive line perspective. Oklahoma's not been as good on the offensive line the last couple of years as they have previously under Bill Bedenbaugh, under the Baker Mayfield and those types of teams. And of course, you have a great quarterback. It makes your offensive line look a little bit better. But under that same token, I don't think either of these teams have played championship football at the offensive line. So, and I think both teams have got some kids either through the transfer portal or through the recruiting cycle here in 2022 cycle that should allow both of those teams to be much better on the offensive line and specifically on the offensive side of the ball.
And there is definitely a difference between Oklahoma's had championship level offensive line, Big 12 championship level, but then not national championship level. There's levels to this. And to get to that national championship level, you have to get guys like Devon Campbell and develop them into first round NFL players. And if you do that, that's championship level. That's Alabama. That's Georgia. You see that factory that they have there where the guy comes in for 3 years. There's a guy sitting behind for 1 or 2 years. They plug and play, and there's hardly any drop off, if any drop off. And that's what you need to get to on the offensive and defensive lines. And let's not forget, that's what wins national championships. These skill players are nice and all, but at the end of the day, the game is won in between the trenches. I fully believe that. Look at the LSU Tigers. I know, look at all the talent they had, but they won the award for the best offensive line in college football that year. You have to build within the trenches, and I think both of our teams need to be able to do that at a national championship level, not just at a Big 12 level.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that's the big difference between what the Big 12 has looked like as a conference overall versus, some of those teams that you'd mentioned. You're absolutely right. I mean, Brent Venables, we talked about this a little bit. He talked about, how you win championships is on the offensive line and the defensive line and the trenches. Some of those teams have been so much better than not only Oklahoma and Texas, but some of the other teams in the Big 12, ACC, what have you, outside of Clemson. They've really been able to dominate that area, and that's where, specifically Oklahoma, that's where they've been, they've been a little bit suspect in some of these playoff games. They've been, I wouldn't go so far as to say dominated, but they've not competed as well as they would have they needed to outside of probably the 2017 semifinal game against Georgia. I think they were okay from an offensive side of the ball. Defensive, they kind of got pushed around. So I think that's the big, maturation factor for Oklahoma specifically coming into next year, and then obviously into the SEC in the future, is to be able to compete on a day in, day out basis. They've got to get those elite level athletes, and they've got to be able to not only get those guys but develop them through the strength and conditioning, through just the natural maturation of those kids throughout the years. And that's the biggest difference. I mean, I think we're on the same page here, Matt. That's the biggest difference. I think Oklahoma and Texas, for that matter, are on the same, are fairly competitive with the Alabamas, with the Georgias, with the Clemsons, with the LSUs, but they've got to have a continued consistent success on the line of scrimmage.
And I think that also goes into when we both move into the SEC, because if you look at it, I fully believe, I know people are saying 2023, but if we're both not ready, we're not going to be there. They're going to push this back as long as they can to help our programs transition, so we have the good enough offensive and defensive lines. I mean, just look at the Arkansas game. Arkansas is a good team. They were one of the 5 best SEC teams. But the thing is, they're not Alabama, Georgia's level, and we got bullied by them. We got absolutely dominated by them. They pushed us around. So we have to be able to – and luckily for us, there's markers. We have these games set up. Next year's Alabama, we'll see how that happens. I don't know if they're going to throw these young guys to the wolves. Personally, I'd probably like that, because I just want them to get their feet wet, start to learn. That's the only way you know how to learn, is you fail, you get better. So there's markers along the way. I forget who we play in the out of conference next year, the year after Alabama. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point that you made about what the timeline looks like for Oklahoma and Texas. I mean, I think both schools and fans, I think everybody's thrilled and just excited. Let's go tomorrow, right? But I think you want to put your teams in a position to be successful. So both sides, if they feel like they're not ready, I could conceivably see that stretching into 2024. I think it would look a little weird, I think, with a new Big 12 structure for Oklahoma and Texas to be there just for a year before they move on. But I think, to your point, if that's what both administrations feel like is needed just to be successful, I wouldn't be surprised to see that even delayed another year.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you guys rate the Big 12 versus the SEC? What do you think is the leap? What would Oklahoma and Texas look like in the SEC now? What would they have done over the last 5 years that's different than the Big 12? Put into words where you think the gap is, how large, and what it involves. Matthew, you talked about offensive line play, and I watched the Arkansas-Texas game as well. That was a good example right there. But just in regards to just some type of context to how much you think there's a difference.
Well, the thing is, I don't think it's like as big as most people say, because they're saying, like, if you get thrown in, you're going to play Alabama, Florida, Georgia, LSU. No, you're not. You're not going to play all of them the same year. You might do that once a decade, but you're definitely going to get your Vandy's in there. your Kentuckys, which is still a good team, but those type of teams, lower level teams. So I think, to be honest, I think you threw Texas in there this year with an SEC schedule and then out of conference games as well. We probably end up one game worse than we were, 4-8. I don't see like that much difference, but I mean, yeah, obviously from the top of the Big 12 to the top of the SEC, that's what makes the SEC great. Their top is just better than everyone else's top. Their middle, to me, is the same as everyone else's middle, and their bottom is the same as everyone else's bottom. But the top is definitely better. I mean, Georgia and Alabama are the cream of the crop. I wouldn't be surprised if they play again in the national championship next year. That wouldn't shock me. Or at some point, I think Brian Kelly's going to get LSU rolling. I mean, that, to me, if you just have a competent coach that can recruit and actually coach X's and O's, LSU is just a sleeping giant. So I would not be shocked if they're in the national championship picture in 2 to 3 years. Florida, we'll see with Billy Napier. I really like him, and recruits seem to like him. They seem to like his authentic personality. He doesn't seem fake. A lot like, I think Dan Mullen was kind of, I called him Tom Herman. I thought he was exactly like Tom Herman, where it was a lot of talk, a lot of just like weird antics. I mean, you come out on the field during halftime of the game and you start cheering up the crowd after a fight. Just a weird guy in general. But I think, like I said, the top of the SEC is just much better, especially in the trenches. I'm going to keep keying on that because I think talent-wise, if you take out the trenches, I think Bijan Robinson is good enough to play in the SEC. I think Quinn Ewers eventually, maybe not this year, will be good enough to play in the SEC. Xavier Worthy's definitely good enough to play in the SEC. He was recruited by Alabama. It's the trenches, and that's what makes the difference between the Big 12 and the SEC.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I won't completely belabor the point about the trenches. I mean, I think we're all on the same page as far as that. I think one of the things for me is recruiting. I think the ability to recruit at a high level in the SEC, specifically in SEC country, is very, very pivotal. I think that's one of the things that you saw with Oklahoma in terms of some of the guys that they brought onto their staff. They had a mix of guys that had previous experience within Oklahoma, within the Big 12, but they also brought some guys in that did have SEC country type of experience, type of inroads from that perspective. So I think another one of the things that, and I can't necessarily speak for Texas here, but I think their off-field staff that actually focus on recruiting year round, I think is going to be really big. From everything that I've kind of read and heard, I think Oklahoma is going to have, anywhere in the neighborhood of 20-25 off-field guys that are having a very, very strong influence on recruiting. And so I think that's, when you look each and every year, you've got Texas A&M, you've got Alabama, you've got Georgia, you've got LSU, you've got all of these teams that are very consistently getting these big time kids. And what are they're on the offensive and defensive line. So being able to kind of marry those 2 points together, I think, Mark, here is that from a recruiting perspective, and also obviously getting those guys in and developing them at the level that they're being developed in the SEC as well.
Definitely. I mean, recruiting is the lifeblood of college football. You can say whatever you want, but I believe like there was a stat on ESPN showed a year or two ago, and I'm always going to remember it. Like the last decade of national champions, if you average out their 4 classes, they're all in the top 10. I think Clemson was the only outlier in their first championship year. So you have to recruit within the top 10 consistently, and the SEC does that. I think they have like 5 or 6 teams in the top 10 this year. So that's how you win there. And it's definitely going to be harder because now you see Texas A&M, especially with NIL money. They have that money, man, so they're going to spend it, and they've got the number 1 class for it. And I'm not blaming them. I would have done the same thing. I think Texas should do it more. They kind of got on the train late, but then when they decided to do it, it paid off. So that's how you're going to win in modern-day college football.
No question about that. I actually didn't see the stat. I came up with the stat myself and just reviewing the recruiting rankings from this most recent class in 22. And this is really sobering to second-tier college football teams that are looking to get to the playoff, win national championships, and compete with the elite. Okay, if your name's not Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia, etc., Kentucky was 13th in the nation in recruiting. They had the 13th rated class in the country. The gap between Texas A&M at 1 and Kentucky at 13 was the same gap as between Kentucky at 13 and 75.
Wow.
And it's like that about every year. That's like the gap between like 1 and 8 is like between like 8 and 25 or 30. Like those 3 or 4 get just ridiculous classes.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I think one of the things that when you talk about the middle tier of the SEC versus the middle tier of the Big 12, I think the one thing, and I agree,
Not
Matt.
to interrupt you, Jason. That's what I was jotting down here. I was checking Matthew on his just his tiers of teams, and I was going to come up with an argument point there, but keep going, Jason. Sorry.
No, you're fine. But I was thinking, a team like Arkansas, they are in a very, very upward trajectory right now based on what they've done through the transfer portal, based on what their recruiting class looks like this year. And I think they've got a really good guy in there in Pittman from a head coaching perspective. So I think when you look at TCU from a Big 12, they've kind of went down a little bit over the last couple of years. So when you kind of compare some of those middle tier teams of the Big 12 versus some of those middle tier teams of the SEC, it kind of appears to be a little bit stronger on the SEC level. But I think the point that Matt made a minute ago is very, very important, and something that we need to make sure that we all remember here is that you're absolutely right. Oklahoma or Texas, they're not going to be playing Alabama, Georgia, Florida, LSU every single year, especially with what's probably going to be some sort of a pod system in the SEC. They're not going to play that game, so it's not the complete murderer's row. Yes, it's tougher than the Big 12, absolutely, but it's not going to be the murderer's row that some people kind of perceive that it might be.
Yeah, and the pod that's talked about for us, I welcome that tremendously. I mean, if it's Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Texas A&M, I'll take that. I think that's a very favorable pod to what could have been. Like, if I don't want to be in a pod with Alabama, I don't want to be a pod with Georgia, I don't want to be a pod with LSU, I'll take those 3 teams over those 3 teams.
So, yeah, I'm trying to divide the conferences. So I took, and it's difficult because obviously you've got a difference between what we saw on the field last year versus where the programs stand. Texas is probably the most difficult program to place in the Big 12 because what tier do they belong in? Well, the recruiting tells us one thing and the play on the field tells us another thing. So obviously this past season, Oklahoma, Baylor, and Oklahoma State were the class of the conference. There's no question about that, but Baylor's one season removed from 2-7. So again, it's kind of difficult to gauge, not everyone's Alabama where the consistency is right here. And that's what they are, or even Oklahoma State in a different way. They're kind of consistently 8-4. I know they were better this past year, of course. So looking at the top tier currently in the SEC, again, from a potential standpoint and recruiting standpoint, you could put Texas A&M and LSU there, but they're not playing like it. It's Alabama and Georgia. So your second, then you throw out Kansas and Vandy at the bottom of each league. There's nobody close to either one of them from a incompetency standpoint. So in the middle, and I know that there are various tiers within the middle, but they're even kind of difficult to differentiate as well. And also to defend the Big 12, when you're comparing the Big 12 and other conferences, especially one of the 14 team conferences, and you're just looking for good teams. Well, you got to understand there's only 10 versus 14. So it's going to be more difficult to find good teams because that's 40% more teams in the SEC. So, this next tier for the Big 12, if you take those 3 out, looks a little weak with Iowa State, TCU, Texas, West Virginia, Kansas State, Texas Tech. It's kind of difficult to differentiate all those schools. For me, it is. Iowa State's been better generally, but they're only coming off a 7-6 campaign. And again, I took 3 big boys out of the Big 12, and I only took 2 out of the SEC. So I left 12 in the SEC, and I only left 7 in the Big 12. So again, tough comparison. But when you look at that collection of teams versus Texas A&M, Arkansas, Tennessee, Florida, LSU, Kentucky, Ole Miss, Arkansas, even Mississippi State. That's a lot of good teams.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. I mean, I think to what we've talked about, and Mark, me and you have talked about this on a lot of occasions. That yes, it's not necessarily murderer's row, but at the same time, you in the SEC, you've got to be ready to play every single week because it's so from top to bottom, there's so many of these teams that can get you, and it's not necessarily the same thing at the Big 12. Yes, you've got some of these teams that are capable of beating you, but exactly the point that you've made about maybe Kansas State, TCU, Texas Tech, some of those guys that are in the middle tier versus a Kentucky, a Mississippi State, and Ole Miss, Arkansas. I think those are it's a much better, it's a much bigger step up in class.
All right, folks, we got Matthew Miller here. He hosts our Texas Post Game on the Voice of College Football over on our Texas channel. So whether you're a Texas fan, college football fan that just likes to keep track of everyone, or an Oklahoma fan that wants to know your enemy, head on over to our Texas channel here at the Voice of College Football. And of course, we're here talking Sooners every Wednesday at 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central Time. And Jason makes this all go here at the Voice of College Football. So we always appreciate Jason being here for 44 consecutive shows. Matthew, thanks for joining us. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to hit on?
I don't think so. I think that's really it.
Good. Matthew, thanks for dropping by. We appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks, man.
All right. Yeah, it's a difficult comparison to make. Again, sometimes the fight isn't fair because of the 10-team structure for the Big 12 versus some of the other conferences. But yeah, definitely. And this is always going to be the case, that there are going to be very capable programs in the SEC who are currently not producing. That's just the nature of it. But the potential of Florida, Tennessee, LSU to ascend, and of course what Texas A&M is doing, not that they're not a good team right now, but their ceiling is high.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the point that we've made here, and one of the things that I said over right now in the Big 12, I think the expectation is for Oklahoma to, at the very least, be in the Big 12 championship game every single year. Granted, I know that Oklahoma did not make it this year, but that still should be the expectation with the rest of the schools that are in the conference. Whereas one thing that I said previously was that if you in the SEC, every 10 years, if you're in the championship game 4 of those 10 years, winning it 2 of those 10 years, I think that's a measure of success. Obviously there's going to be growing pains, right, for both Oklahoma and Texas coming into this conference. And I think, but the one point that Matt made was very interesting that I really haven't thought a whole lot about, is that if both of these administrations think that they're not quite ready, from a competitive perspective, do they hold on a year versus just going in and saying, okay, we understand we're going to take some lumps here early on, but then we're going to kind of go from there. So I think that will be interesting to kind of keep an eye on this year on both of Oklahoma and Texas, how well they perform on the field, and are they ready to and is that a big part of the conversation, or is it like, okay, we want the SEC money now, if we're not necessarily as ready on the field, we can get there in quick fashion.
Yeah, it's also interesting that you can correct me if I'm wrong. There's nothing, at least on the surface, that I know of that really ties these two programs together, other than being fierce rivals on the field and playing in the same conference, just like a whole lot of other programs out there. Nothing that technically ties them together until now. Yeah, there would have to be some level of cooperation between the two to determine, along with the SEC, when they're going to make that leap. So it's just interesting that they're the fiercest of rivals in the Big 12 and arguably across the country. And they're attached at the hip now in regards to their move from the Big 12 to the SEC.
Yeah, and I mean, Texas doesn't really worry about this, but when you look at Oklahoma from a from a scheduling perspective, I think part of what comes into consideration, I don't know that it's a big consideration in terms of um, the pin in terms of when they move, but I think scheduling, does Oklahoma keep that game with Oklahoma State, given how tough of a schedule the SEC conference is going to be? Do you play a non-conference game, which would be a home and home, every other year? Do you play a conference game that's as tough as an Oklahoma State is, comparatively speaking, year in and year out? So I don't know. I think the some of the OU people have said that they're going to try everything that they do can to keep playing the game. I think some of the Oklahoma State people are not quite as um, optimistic that will occur, but it's something to consider. I think when with that game, do you if you want to keep that, or if you want to have the strategy, at least early on, that you have a little bit of a weaker non-conference schedule, knowing maybe it doesn't necessarily get you ready as much as you would like, but it's still um, it still gives you a couple of wins to build that confidence going into the SEC.
All right, folks, we appreciate you being here. Over 100 on the line for the portion of the show that you missed. Please wait for the video to post, and it'll be there for you to watch anytime. So we have wrapped it up for this week. We appreciate everybody being here. Grab 2 or 3 friends that love Oklahoma football and bring them on in next Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. Central Time. In the meantime, catch Jason's work at Last Word on College Football and the rest of what's provided there by the fine folks there at Last Word on College Football. Jason, appreciate you being here as always. Have a good rest of your week, and we will be back here, God willing, next Wednesday.
All right, no problem. Thanks. You too.